Every time old Martha Coyle lost someone she loved, she walked out to the edge of her land, dug a hole in the soft earth with her own 2 hands, and planted a tree. She never explained why, and by the time she was 78 years old, there were more than 200 trees standing in that field, a whole silent forest of them, growing at the edge of the world. Martha had farmed that land near Willow Creek her entire life. She was a small, quiet woman, weathered by decades of sun and wind, with hands that had worked the soil since she was a girl. She'd married young to a good man named Henry, and together they'd built a life on that farm, raised their children there, buried Martha's own parents there, and grown old together beneath its wide skies. Henry had passed some 15 years ago now, and Martha lived alone, tending her fields and her animals, and most of all, her trees. The people in town knew her as kindly but private. She kept to herself, came into town only when she needed to, and never spoke much about her personal affairs. And the one thing about her that puzzled everyone was that field of trees, row upon row of them, all different kinds, oaks and maples, apple and cherry and pear, willows and pines, planted seemingly at random over the course of 50 years. Some were massive now, ancient and towering. Others were young saplings, freshly set in the ground. "Martha and her orchard," folks would say with a fond smile. "That woman does love her trees." They assumed it was a hobby, a comfort, the eccentricity of a lonely old widow. Not one of them knew the truth, because Martha never told anyone that each of those trees was a person. It had started when Martha was just a young woman, the year her mother died. Overcome with grief she didn't know how to carry, Martha wandered out to the edge of the farm and, hardly knowing why, planted a small apple tree in the soft spring earth. And as she pressed the soil down around its roots, she felt something in her heart ease, just a little. It was as though she'd given her grief somewhere to live, somewhere it could grow into something living and green instead of just aching inside her. From that day on, Martha planted a tree for every soul she lost. When her father died, she planted an oak, strong and steady the way he'd been. When she lost her first child to a fever, a tiny thing who lived only a few days, Martha planted a cherry tree, small and delicate, that bloomed pink every spring. When a dear friend passed, or a neighbor, or a beloved animal, out to the field Martha would go, and another tree would take root. She planted one for the young soldier from Willow Creek who never came home from the war. She planted one for the school teacher who'd been kind to her children. She planted one for the old doctor who delivered half the town. Each tree was chosen to suit the person it honored, and to each one Martha gave a small hand-carved wooden name tag tied to a low branch, so she would always remember whose life that tree carried. And when her Henry died, Martha planted the largest tree of all, a great spreading willow right in the center of the field, where its long branches could watch over all the others. For 50 years she tended that living memorial. Every morning she walked among the trees and greeted them by name. She talked to them, told them the news, remembered aloud the people they stood for. To Martha, that field wasn't an orchard at all. It was a gathering of everyone she had ever loved and lost, a place where none of them were truly gone, where they all still stood together, rooted in the earth, reaching toward the sky. It was, she often thought, the most crowded and least lonely place in all the world. Then, in Martha's 78th year, the letters came. The county wanted to build a new highway, and the surveyors had determined that the most efficient route ran directly through the eastern edge of Martha's farm, straight through her field of trees. The letters were polite but firm. The land would be purchased at fair market value, whether Martha agreed or not. The trees would be cleared. Construction would begin in the spring. Martha wrote back. She called. She went into town to plead her case before the county board. but it was hard to explain. When the officials asked why she was so distraught over losing a field of trees she'd be well compensated for, trees that, after all, were just trees, Martha found she couldn't put it into words. How do you explain to a room full of strangers that they're about to bulldoze your mother and your father and your children and your husband and half the people you ever loved? She tried, but it came out as the rambling of a grief-stricken old woman, and the board, though not unkind, saw no legal reason to reroute an entire highway for one elderly farmer's sentimental attachment to her orchard. The decision stood. In the spring, the trees would come down. Word spread through Willow Creek, and most folks felt sorry for Martha in that distant way people do. But a highway was a highway, and progress was progress, and there wasn't much anyone could do. The date was set, the bulldozers were scheduled. But there was one young woman in town who couldn't quite let it go. Her name was Sarah, and she worked for a reporter for the little county newspaper. Something about the old woman's grief had struck her as far too deep for a mere orchard, and she decided to drive out to Martha's farm and hear her story properly for an article. And it was Sarah, sitting at Martha's kitchen table over a cup of tea, who finally coaxed out the truth. Martha told her everything. She told her about the apple tree for her mother and the oak for her father and the little cherry tree for the baby she'd lost. She walked Sarah out into the field, and she took her from tree to tree, reading the weathered name tags aloud, telling the story of each life. Here was the soldier, here was the school teacher, here was the old doctor, here the great willow was her Henry. 214 trees, 214 souls, 50 years of love and loss, standing silent and green at the edge of the world. By the time they'd walked the whole field, Sarah was weeping. She went home and she wrote the story of her life. Not a dry article about a land dispute, but the true story, the story of Martha Coyle and her forest of the beloved dead. She wrote about what each tree meant and named the people of Willow Creek who were honored there, many of whom the town still remembered. And when that story ran on the front page of the county paper, everything changed. Because it turned out that Martha hadn't just been remembering her own dead, she'd been remembering the town's. Half those trees stood for people that families all over Willow Creek had loved and grieved themselves. That great oak was somebody's grandfather. That maple was somebody's mother. That cherry tree by the fence honored a child that a family down the road still mourned. Martha, in her quiet solitude, had built a memorial to the whole community's sorrow and love, and nobody had ever known. The response was overwhelming. People drove out from all over the county to walk among the trees and find the ones that carried their own loved ones. They wept beneath the branches. They left flowers. They thanked the old woman who, without ever meaning to, had been keeping their dead alive in green and growing things for half a century. And then they got angry that anyone would dare bulldoze such a place. The town rose up. Hundreds of people signed petitions. They packed the county board meeting until there was standing room only. Family after family stood up to speak about the tree that carried their loved one and what it would mean to lose it. Sarah's story got picked up by the city papers, then the television news, and soon the whole state knew about Martha Coyle and her forest of remembrance. And under the weight of all that love and all that grief and all that public outcry, the county did something it almost never does. It moved the highway. The route was redrawn to curve gently around the eastern edge of Martha's farm, sparing every last tree. And more than that, the county board, deeply moved, voted to designate the field a protected memorial grove to be preserved forever so that no highway or development could ever threaten it again. On the day they announced it, the whole town came out to Martha's farm to celebrate. They gathered among the trees at sunset, hundreds of them, touching the branches, reading the name tags, embracing the small, weathered old woman who, without ever meaning to, had given their grief a place to live and grow. Martha stood in the center of it all, beneath her Henry great willow, and she wept, not from sorrow this time, but from a joy almost too big for her old heart to hold. "I always thought I was carrying all of this alone," she told the crowd, her voice trembling. 50 years, planting these trees, remembering all of you, by myself. And now look at all of you here. Turns out we were never grieving alone at all. We were grieving together all this time. We just didn't know it. Martha lived several more years, and she never planted alone again. When someone in Willow Creek lost a loved one now, the whole town would come out to the grove, and together they'd plant a tree and hang a name tag and remember.